The Formation of Ghana, Part 1, The Ancient Empire. All right, so let's begin with Ghana, though not the modern nation we know today. To tell the full story of Ghana, we first have to go back to West Africa, around 300 CE, where one of the most powerful and influential empires in African history began to rise, the Ghana Empire. And here's the thing, it wasn't located where modern Ghana is today. It was actually centered in what is now Mali and Mauritania, but its legacy still connects to the Ghana we know today. The Ghana Empire, also called Wagyu by its people, was a hub of trade, wealth, and culture. Picture this. Vast stretches of savanna dotted with trading towns, caravans of camels laden with salt and gold snaking across the desert. This was Ghana, a crossroads between North Africa, where Berber traders came from, and sub-Saharan Africa, rich in resources like gold and ivory. Now, when we say Ghana was wealthy, we're talking about legendary wealth. The empire sat on some of the richest gold deposits in the world, and gold became its most valuable export. In fact, Arab traders who visited the region often referred to it as the land of gold. The king of Ghana controlled this trade, taxing goods that passed through his territory, and with those taxes, he built a mighty army and a lavish court. The king wasn't just a ruler, he was a symbol of divine authority, someone who represented the gods. But it wasn't just about gold. Ghana's wealth was also tied to another commodity, salt. In the hot, dry Sahel, salt was worth its weight in gold, literally. People needed it to preserve food and stay healthy, and Ghana's location made it the perfect middleman for the trans-Saharan salt trade. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the empire was at its peak, a thriving center of trade and culture. Towns like Kumbi Saleh, Ghana's capital, were bustling with merchants, scholars, and travelers from across Africa and beyond. Islam began to spread through trade, as Muslim merchants brought not only goods, but also ideas, books, and religion. And here's what's fascinating. While the kings of Ghana often allowed Islam to flourish, they didn't abandon their traditional beliefs. They struck a balance, respecting both their own spiritual traditions and the new religion. But as with many great empires, Ghana's power wasn't destined to last. By the 11th century, pressures from all sides began to mount. The Almoravids, a Berber Muslim group from North Africa, invaded Ghana, weakening its control over trade routes. At the same time, internal conflicts and competition from neighboring states chipped away at the empire's stability. By the 13th century, Ghana had declined, and its place as the dominant power in the region was taken by a new rising star, the Mali Empire. And that's where we'll pause for now. The Ghana Empire may have faded, but its legacy, its wealth, its trade networks, its cultural influence laid the foundation for the powerful states that followed. In the next part, we'll shift to the rise of modern Ghana, shaped by centuries of migration, colonization, and resistance. This story is just getting started. The Formation of Ghana Part 2, The Arrival of Europeans and the Gold Coast. So, we've left behind the ancient Ghana Empire, which was a world away in time and place from the Ghana we know today. Now let's fast forward a few centuries and shift southward to the region of modern-day Ghana. This area was home to powerful kingdoms like the Akan states, the Ashanti Empire, and others that thrived long before Europeans ever set foot on African soil. All right, picture this. It's the late 15th century, and European explorers are just starting to venture along Africa's west coast. The Portuguese are the first to arrive in 1471. They're not here for sightseeing, they're here for gold. They've heard stories about West Africa's wealth, and when they land in what is now Ghana, they find exactly what they're looking for. Gold. Lots of it. The Portuguese quickly set up shop, building Elmina Castle in 1482. Elmina became a hub for gold trade, and over time, the Portuguese weren't just trading gold, they were trading people. The transatlantic slave trade was beginning to take shape, and the Gold Coast, what Ghana was called at the time, became one of its central points. Now, this isn't an easy part of the story to talk about, but it's crucial. Enslaved Africans were captured or sold by local rulers and merchants, often in exchange for European goods like guns and textiles. They were then shipped across the Atlantic to work in brutal conditions in the Americas. By the end of the 17th century, millions of Africans had been forcibly taken from this region. But let's step back for a second. This period wasn't just about European exploitation. The local African states were far from passive players in this story. Powerful kingdoms like the Ashanti and the Fante Confederacy were deeply involved in the trade, using it to strengthen their own power. The Ashanti, for example, became one of the most formidable kingdoms in West Africa. They built a centralized state, complete with an advanced bureaucracy and a strong military. The golden stool, a sacred symbol of their unity and authority, became the cornerstone of Ashanti identity. By the 18th century, the Gold Coast had become a chessboard for European powers. The British, Dutch, and Danes all wanted control of its trade, building forts and castles along the coastline. If you've ever heard of Cape Coast Castle or Fort Christiansborg, these were some of the largest structures. These weren't just trading posts, they were also prisons for enslaved Africans awaiting transport across the Atlantic. Here's the thing about this period. While it's easy to frame it as a story of European domination, the reality is much more complicated. The African kingdoms played a pivotal role, both resisting and collaborating with European powers, depending on their own interests. There were alliances, betrayals, and constant negotiations. The Ashanti, for instance, weren't shy about going toe-to-toe with the British. They fought several wars, known as the Anglo-Ashanti Wars, throughout the 19th century, trying to maintain their sovereignty. But by the late 1800s, the tide began to turn. Europe's appetite for African territory had grown, and during the scramble for Africa, the Gold Coast officially became a British colony in 1874. The British abolished the slave trade by then, but they weren't exactly there to help. They were after resources, gold, cocoa, timber, and they set up a colonial administration to exploit the land and its people. The Ashanti were eventually defeated, their capital Kumasi captured, and their territory absorbed into the colony. And so, by the early 20th century, the people of the Gold Coast found themselves living under British rule. But here's the thing, they weren't going to accept it quietly. The seeds of resistance, of independence, were already being planted. Local leaders, inspired by global movements for freedom and equality, were beginning to push back. In the next part, we'll see how these seeds grew, how the people of the Gold Coast went from a colonized land to the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence. This is where the fight for modern Ghana begins. Stay with me. It's about to get inspiring. The Formation of Ghana, Part 3, The Fight for Independence. So now we're in the early 20th century. The Gold Coast is firmly under British control, its people taxed and governed by colonial officials who cared more about extracting resources than improving the lives of the local population. But here's the thing about colonialism. It never sits well for long. People always push back. And in the Gold Coast, that resistance was about to take shape in a way that would inspire an entire continent. Let's set the stage. By the 1920s and 1930s, there were cracks forming in the colonial system. World War I had left Britain drained, and World War II, well, that only made things worse. Meanwhile, in the colonies, a new class of educated Africans was emerging. Teachers, lawyers, civil servants, people who had studied in Europe or America and were starting to ask tough questions. Why were they living under foreign rule? Why couldn't Africans govern themselves? This new class of thinkers began organizing. They formed political groups, wrote petitions, and demanded change. At first, these demands were small, things like better pay for workers and a say in local government. But over time, the conversation shifted. People weren't just asking for reforms anymore. They were asking for freedom. And this is where Kwame Nkrumah comes in. If you've heard of Ghana's independence, you've probably heard his name. Nkrumah was born in 1909, a son of the Gold Coast. He studied in the US, where he was deeply influenced by thinkers like Marcus Garvey and W.B. Du Bois, and then in Britain, where he became involved in Pan-African movements. By the time he returned to the Gold Coast in 1947, he wasn't just thinking about freedom for his country, he was thinking about freedom for all of Africa. Now, Nkrumah didn't start this movement alone. When he first came back, he joined a group called the United Gold Coast Convention, which was pushing for self-government. But Nkrumah, well, he wasn't exactly patient. He thought the UGCC was moving too slowly, too cautiously. So, in 1949, he broke away and formed his own party, the Convention People's Party, or CPP. And with the CPP, Nkrumah did something that hadn't been done before. He took the independence movement to the people. This was grassroots organizing at its finest. Nkrumah and the CPP rallied workers, farmers, students, ordinary people who were tired of colonial rule. Their slogan? Self-government now, not later, not in 10 or 20 years. Now, and the British? Yeah, they weren't thrilled. They arrested Nkrumah in 1950, trying to silence him. But if anything, it backfired. While he was in prison, his popularity only grew. His party won elections in 1951, forcing the British to release him and give him a role in government. Over the next few years, Nkrumah pushed harder and harder for full independence. The British, weakened by World War II and facing independence movements across their empire, couldn't hold on forever. Finally, in 1957, it happened. On March 6, the Gold Coast became Ghana, the first sub-Saharan African country to achieve independence. It wasn't just a victory for Ghana, it was a victory for Africa. Nkrumah himself called it a step toward the total liberation of the African continent. But independence wasn't just about waving a new flag. Ghana was free, sure, but now came the hard part, building a nation. Nkrumah had big dreams. He wanted Ghana to be a beacon for the rest of Africa, a model of unity and progress. He poured resources into schools, infrastructure, and industry. Well, dreams don't always go as planned. We'll dig into that in the next part. Ghana is free, but freedom comes with challenges. Economic, political, and personal. The story of Ghana's independence isn't over yet. It's only just begun. The Formation of Ghana, Part 4, Dreams and Challenges of Independence. So, it's 1957. Ghana is free. The world is watching. And there's this energy, this hope that finally Africa is stepping into a new era. Kwame Nkrumah is at the center of it all, a leader with a vision. Not just for Ghana, but for the entire continent. He wanted Ghana to be more than just a newly independent country. He wanted it to be a symbol of African liberation, a leader in the fight against colonialism everywhere. And at first things looked promising. Nkrumah poured resources into modernizing Ghana. New schools, roads, factories, and even one of his most ambitious projects, the Akosombo Dam, which would generate electricity and transform Ghana's economy. Ghana also became a hub for Pan-Africanism. Nkrumah invited leaders from across the continent to join him in Accra to talk about unity, independence, and the dream of a United States of Africa. But here's the thing. Nation building is hard. Really hard. And Ghana was facing challenges from the very start. First, there were economic problems. While Ghana was rich in resources like cocoa, the economy was heavily dependent on global markets. If cocoa prices fell, Ghana's economy suffered, a harsh reality that no amount of visionary speeches could change. And then there were the costs of modernization. All those schools, factories, and infrastructure projects, they were expensive, and Ghana started borrowing heavily. Debt piled up, and by the early 1960s, the economy was struggling. Then there was the political side. Nkrumah's vision for unity, both in Ghana and across Africa, was noble, but it wasn't easy to achieve. Ghana was a diverse country with different ethnic groups and political factions. Not everyone agreed with Nkrumah's policies or his leadership style. Over time, he started to crack down on dissent. The Preventive Detention Act allowed him to imprison political opponents without trial, and he declared Ghana a one-party state in 1964. And well, let's just say this didn't sit well with everyone. Opposition to Nkrumah grew, not just among political elites, but also among ordinary Ghanaians who were frustrated with rising prices and a struggling economy. Meanwhile, outside forces were watching closely. The Cold War was in full swing, and both the United States and the Soviet Union were competing for influence in Africa. Ghana, with its strategic location and charismatic leader, became a key player in this global game. Now, here's where the suspense builds. By the mid-1960s, Nkrumah's hold on power was slipping. He was still popular with some, but many were growing tired of his authoritarian approach. And then in 1966, while Nkrumah was on a state visit to North Vietnam and China, the military struck a coup d'etat. Nkrumah's government was overthrown, and just like that, the man who had led Ghana to independence was exiled. He spent the rest of his life in Guinea, a guest of his friend and fellow Pan-Africanist leader Sekou Touré. Nkrumah never returned to Ghana, and when he died in 1972, he was still a polarizing figure, revered by some, criticized by others. Back in Ghana, things didn't exactly improve. After the coup, the country entered a period of political instability, with a series of military and civilian governments taking power. Corruption, mismanagement, and economic crises plagued the nation. By the 1980s, Ghana's economy had hit rock bottom. Inflation was out of control, unemployment was rampant, and basic goods were scarce. But even in the darkest times, there was resilience. Ghanaians found ways to survive, to adapt, and to hope for a better future. And by the late 1980s, a new chapter was about to begin, a chapter of renewal, reform, and eventually democracy. We'll explore that in the final part. Ghana's journey from instability to a thriving democracy is nothing short of remarkable. Stay with me. The best is yet to come. Formation of Ghana, Part 5, Stability and Democracy. All right, so we've reached the 1980s. Ghana is at a crossroads. Decades of coups, economic struggles, and political instability have left the country exhausted. But here's the thing about Ghana. It's a place of resilience. No matter how tough things got, the people of Ghana never gave up on the dream of a better future. And in this final part, we'll see how Ghana transformed itself into one of Africa's most stable democracies. Let's start with the turning point. Jerry John Rawlings. Rawlings is one of the most important and, let's be honest, complex figures in modern Ghanaian history. He first came to power through a coup in 1979 and again in 1981. But unlike many military leaders, Rawlings didn't cling to power for its own sake. He had a vision for Ghana, a vision rooted in reform. In the 1980s, Rawlings and his government implemented sweeping economic changes. They worked with international organizations like the World Bank and the IMF to stabilize Ghana's economy. Now, this wasn't without controversy. Those reforms involved austerity measures that were tough on ordinary Ghanaians. But over time, they worked. By the 1990s, Ghana's economy was recovering, inflation was under control, and industries like cocoa production were picking up again. And then something remarkable happened. Rawlings, the military ruler, became Rawlings, the Democrat. In 1992, he oversaw the writing of a new constitution and transitioned Ghana to a multi-party democracy. That year, Ghana held its first free and fair elections in over a decade. Rawlings won, this time as a civilian president, and in 2000 he stepped down peacefully, handing over power to his successor. It was a moment that signaled a new chapter for Ghana, a chapter of political stability. Since then, Ghana has become a beacon of democracy in Africa. Peaceful transfers of power have become the norm, with multiple political parties competing in free elections. Leaders like John Kufuor, John Atta Mills, and Nana Akufo-Addo have continued to build on the foundations of democracy, while the country has become known for its vibrant civil society, press freedom, and respect for human rights. But Ghana's success isn't just about politics, it's about the people. Ghanaians have worked hard to rebuild their country, drawing on a deep sense of community and cultural pride. Today, Ghana is one of the most stable countries in West Africa, with a growing economy fueled by gold, cocoa, and oil. Cities like Accra are thriving hubs of innovation and creativity, while the country's cultural heritage continues to inspire, from the vibrant kente cloth to the historic forts along the Cape Coast that remind us of the past. And Ghana's global influence? It's growing. The country has become a leader in African diplomacy, hosting peace talks and contributing to UN missions. The Year of Return in 2019, a celebration inviting the African diaspora to reconnect with their roots, drew people from all over the world to Ghana, solidifying its place as a spiritual and cultural home for many. So how do we bring it all together? Ghana's story is one of transformation. From the ancient Ghana Empire to the colonial Gold Coast, from the fight for independence to the challenges of nation-building, Ghana has faced its share of struggles. But it's also a story of resilience, of a people who refuse to give up, even in the face of immense challenges. Today, Ghana stands as a symbol of what's possible, a nation that honors its history, embraces its diversity, and looks toward the future with hope. The journey hasn't been easy, and it's far from over. But if Ghana's past is any indication, its future is as bright as the gold that first drew the world's attention to its shores. And that's a legacy worth celebrating.